So I'm the environmental program manager for the Squaxin Island tribe. Been there for going on to be 20 years this spring coming in here. Started as a marine biologist down in San Diego, worked up in fisheries in different areas, got hired as marine biology for the tribe, and now moved up to sitting at a desk and staring at a computer, doing a lot of stuff. But been here for a while, and thank you. So quick history on the tribe. So Squaxin Island tribe is actually a band. They're family bands based on all the different inlets down here. So it's not really a tribe as you think as others, like a Puyallup tribe or an Nisqually or Skokomish had like a head there, and there was one, it was going down to the people. The Squaxin Island tribe was really based on family bands that were kind of independent on all the different inlets. The one down here, which this Cranberry Creek goes down into Oakland Bay and hammers the inlet, was the Sahawamish with that. So when the treaty was signed by Governor Stevens, they had these different tribes, but then they had all these bands, and they each sent representatives to it. So the tribes are really easy. There's 3 people from Nisqually, 3 people from Puyallup like that, and then all these others. So they just combined everyone else that was left over that they could and called them the name they could pronounce a little bit closer to it, and that was the Case Inlet band, and it's closer to Squaxin with that. So that leads to is the Squaxin's usual and a custom area, and that's the words from the treaty, the area that they used to harvest and all that, is everything in South Puget Sound south of the Tacoma Narrows. And all the fresh water going into it except for the Nisqually River. So why I say that is that's a huge area. That's like over 30% of all of Puget Sound shorelines. We don't have a major river system. The Deschutes is kind of almost like a bigger stream within that. We combine all our streams like Cranberry and Deer and all these together, and it's the same as the Puyallup system. It's the same amount of water and fish. So there's a huge amount of area for Squaxin to cover. We're a relatively small department, so we take areas of interest where we're concentrating. One of those happens to be Oakland Bay, and there's a bunch of good reasons for that. Oakland Bay, Hammersley Inlet, has 9 salmon streams within it, 7 of those considered major, like Cranberry. The state requires us to tier our streams, which ones are our most important. That's the most dense amount of salmon streams in one area in Puget Sound, is all within this Oakland Bay area. Hugely important for shellfish. 3 million pounds of clams come out of just Oakland Bay itself. That's 60% of all the manila clams in the United States come from just these waters like right here. Another 1.8 million pounds of oysters comes out of Oakland Bay. 23 shellfish growers, including the tribe, in there. So there's a lot going on. So the tribe has prioritized one of our areas to focus on with limited staff. Has been, since I've been here at least, in this Oakland Bay area. And you know, we've done quite a bit. Just talking on the marine area within that, we've worked with our partners, mostly Capital Land Trust, conserved 245 acres and 4 miles of shoreline within Oakland Bay. A lot of that is for conservation for natural purposes, but you guys get something in there too. One of the grants I got Eagle Point right down within the city of Shelton. We gave that to the city, and it's now a passive recreation park within that. I hope everyone's been out to Bayshore. Used to be the golf course. We worked hard with Capital Land Trust. You know, that had nothing to do with us. That golf course was closing anyways. That was slated for homes, but they were nice enough to work with Capital Land Trust, open that thing up for the public. So there's a lot going on there. We've worked with Simpson down in Shelton Harbor. Did a 100-acre cleanup on that, on legacy pollution that's been there for 100 years, and then put that into conservation also, so that whole entire harbor is now conserved. Removed half a mile of bulkheads within there, a quarter mile of riparian, planted 10,000 trees, and one of my projects, you've probably seen it down there, is we've started restoring 17 acres of salt marsh within that by restoring stuff that's been dredged out, and have another 17 acres planned.
And that's by Shelton?
That's right downtown Shelton. So you can go there at low tide, go into the yacht club and look out. There's, right now it's mounds of dirt, and we're starting to do plantings within those whole areas. So a lot of interest with the tribe working on these streams. Another one of the ones that we've looked at is Cranberry Creek. One of our major salmon streams, as I said, has coho, chum, 2 runs of chum, way to look at it. There's an early or summer chum that's still kind of open right now what those are, and then a late fall chum. So you'll just see one group comes in earlier, another group comes in later, and then of course cutthroat trout. So this is a very important one that we've been looking at. One of the things we do to monitor that is we have a juvenile trap down on the bottom. So it's Twin Rivers. Remember what I said, one of these areas that, oh, I didn't mention, so of the 9 major salmon streams, 6 of the estuaries are conserved right now. And that includes this one going down in what's called Twin Rivers on Capital Land Trust. Within that, where Cranberry Creek and Deer Creek come together, that whole thing is now conserved. So we run a juvenile trap down there that goes in the spring, and that looks at for the baby salmon going out. We could be able to count those within that. And then another one, which is a big one, is adult trap, which is you see right here. This is one of only 3 adult traps in South Puget Sound. They're very hard to run unless you have a structure. So they have tried them in the past, and I've done these down in California. You can do it in the summertime, it's not so bad. You put a giant weir across and you maintain it. Well, try that when massive rainstorms and flows are going on. It doesn't work very well. But if we have a structure, something like this, there's one here, there's one on Chambers on a dam, there's one on Deschutes on the dam, that if you've ever walked on the Deschutes system in there, those are the 3 adult traps. So these are really valuable for us to look at a bunch of different things as an adult trap. So we have an idea of the juveniles going out. We run all sorts of traps in all our other streams, but it's really hard to find adults coming back. Sue was talking about, she goes and helps Capital Land Trust do surveys on Johns Creek within that. And you can pick a one little area and look at that over time and see the fish coming back. But of course, fish are coming up in the night, they're coming up during rainstorms, there's all sorts of stuff. You don't know what's going on the whole system. So it's really valuable to have something like this where you know exactly what went up for adults and exactly what came out. One of the things that we look at is Squaxin Island Tribe, cooperative with the state of Washington, runs a net pen program over between Squaxin and Harstine Island for coho. So we release about 2 million coho a year. Now these are hatchery fish. You heard like net pen. This is not like that one that collapsed a couple of years ago up there. Those are Atlantic salmon. Those are salmon that are raised for 1 to 2 years within this net pen. This program brings them in about February, puts them in the water there, and then releases them in April. So the idea is they just imprint on this one area and then come back. This is actually an accidental thing. The state of Washington was trying to grow year-round coho. It turns out you can't do that with West Coast fish. That's why you only hear about Atlantic salmon being grown year-round. They've tried it with all the different species, Chinook, chum, coho. They tried it in South Sound at this net pen. Got too hot in the summertime, so they cut the fish out. And 1 year later, year and a half later, just tens of thousands of fish just came back and just swam around the island and didn't know what to do. Really ideal location because there's no salmon streams around that whole area. The fish come back, they're available to sport and tribal fishermen. They can hit those, but they're not going to stray. So there's an idea, you don't want hatchery fish straying into your wild streams. And I'm going to use wild a little bit with air quotes, is that all these streams have been planted with fish at one point. One thing that's hard to wrap your head around is they started planting fish in 1897 in the Pacific Northwest. The National Park Service and what was the thing before NOAA, Department of Fisheries, was walking around with mule trains carrying fish because there wasn't enough salmon. So the heydays of this were the 30s through the 60s, where everything was just planted with fish all over the place. You know, we've tried to look at records. They had planting records from back then, and actually interviewed long retired DFW, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, truck driver who was planting. And he's like, yeah, those records all looked really good, but what you didn't know is we stopped at every single freshwater thing on the way where we were supposed to go and dump fish. But a lot of that stopped in the 60s, early 70s. One, because it wasn't really working. They kept dumping more and more fish, but they weren't necessarily getting a lot more returns. So since then, we still can call these relatively wild because at least these fish have adapted to this system. So what we don't want necessarily is new hatchery fish coming in. So we go back to our net pen program. We don't, according to NOAA, doesn't want to see any more than 5% straying in any of these systems. So one way we can do that is all the coho that go out to the net pens, every one of those has an adipose clip. It's a little fin down on their bottom by their tail that's clipped off that you can go look at and, okay, this was a hatchery fish. We also take about 50,000 of those and put a little tiny microscopic tag inside of it. So you read it with a microscope and you can actually see the number from it, so you know exactly when this fish was let loose. Those are really important because you can, I'll talk about that in a second, where you can find where those fish are caught. But again, getting back to what Sue's doing, when you look at one little area, you really want to know how many fish go through. So we can see every single fish that goes through here, especially for the coho, where we don't want to see that. So I said we don't want to get above 5%. We can look at this trap, the Chambers trap, and the Deschutes, and we're way below 1%. Somewhere between 0.3 and 0.5% every year amount of strays. That's good. We want to be able to keep monitoring that over time. Another thing we want to be able to do with adult traps is look at the effects of marine survival. So there's a lot going on up here. We think about our fish, what's going on up in here, but what's really driving everything is the harvest and marine survival out in the oceans in there. And you want to have an idea of, you know how many fish went out, you definitely want to have an idea of how many get back to know what happened out in the oceans. So let's talk about harvest. Most people don't know this, is that every fish produced down here, state of Washington, all this, over 60% of those fish, 63%, are harvested in Alaska and Canada before they even come back down here. Now how we know this is those little tiny tags I was talking about. So especially the Canadians are also really good about doing trawl surveys. They go out with a big net, look at the little fish, find the ones that got these tags in them. They'll know where the fish are going. So we know that our fish leave here, go up into lower southeast Alaska. That's where most of the harvest is that happens out there. They start coming back, and that's something in the state of Washington the tribes have no say over. That's between Alaska and the federal government. We have no say what Alaska does. And to be fair to the Alaskans, they'll say they're very protective of their own fish. They say they've always fished this way. Just because you guys are down here putting in strip malls and destroying everything and getting the money for it, why do we have to change? So that's very contentious up there with their congressional delegations and the negotiations. So then the fish come back to Washington waters at this point. Now that's where the tribes in the state of Washington go into negotiations about harvest. And you probably heard the Bolt decision. That was a lawsuit from back in the 70s. That's where the 50-50 split is. Agree with it or don't, the tribes definitely agree with it within that. But that starts going into that negotiation. So then the state gets their 50%. They have to decide how much they want to give to their net fishermen, the 27 or so guys who run big giant net boats off the coast of Washington. They get their percentage. Then the fish come into Strait of Juan de Fuca and start coming into Puget Sound. Now you've got all the tribes get their percentages before these fish are coming back. And there's a Puget Sound state fishery with big trawlers that get their amount come down here. Finally, we get all the way down South Sound past the Nisqually tribe. Now we're down to our fish just here. So the only reason I'm throwing that out is I'll hear this a lot, it's the Indians and the problem and the nets in the rivers. One, I'll touch on that, Squaxin doesn't fish in rivers. But there's a lot going on before we even get down here, and it's a lot more complicated than that. Squaxin Island tribe does not fish in fresh water and has not in probably over 40 years. That's for conservation purposes. Our fishermen will be out in the Puget Sound doing things. They do not fish within the inlets during coho season or chum season, again for conservation purposes. So the finger inlet's going in there, but the main part of Puget Sound around Squaxin Island is where a lot of the fisheries go in there, and Chinook within Butt Inlet for a hatchery run that goes through. So again, it gets all complicated, but what that tells us is we know exactly how many fish went out and exactly how many fish came back because of things like this trap. That tells us the marine survival exactly in there to know what it is. Puget Sound, South Puget Sound used to have the highest marine survival in all of Washington, 50, 60, 70s. For coho, it was up 27, 32%, which is really high. So think about every little fish that goes out, 32% of those survived. All these fisheries, all the predation, everything else. About late 1990s, there was a general West Coast, California to Alaska crash in marine survival within that. So that 27% dropped to about 3%. So now South Puget Sound is probably one of the lower ones in there. The coast is a little bit better. But this is everywhere, from all the way from Central California all the way up to central British Columbia going on. But one of the ways we can tell that is we use this stuff to be able to monitor. It's changed a little bit through time, kind of jumped up and around, but it's been stuck there a little bit. So there's a lot of modeling going on. They think there was a big trophic shift. Trophic just means who's eating who and where it is. They just thought somewhere between the 90s was a big change in ocean conditions and it was a shift. So whether that's a long-term trend or it's some sort of big, long, giant cycles, and there's all these specific decadal oscillation, PDO, you may have heard that term thrown out there, but it's these long-term 30, 40-year trends in how good ocean conditions are for fish and where we are. And there's several of those, and it gets really complicated. So it's unclear at this point for in the ocean what's going on with that and whether that's going to come back. Another thing we can do is we like to look at is habitat effects. So again, we know how many adults are coming in here. We know each female is going to have anywhere between 2,400 and 4,300 eggs. We know this is a coho. We'll know exactly how many go up, and then we know how many juveniles come out a year later. So a coho, female and males come up, they'll spawn. They're starting to spawn right now. Coho are an ideal species to study for this because their eggs are going to hatch in the spring. The juveniles are going to go out. They have to spend the entire summer and then the next winter up in Cranberry Creek within this whole area, and then they'll come out the next year. So you definitely get habitat effects. A chum's a little bit different. They're going to come up about now. They're starting to spawn generally in a different area than where the coho is, and they'll hatch in the spring and they'll head straight out into Puget Sound. We also know we do little beach stain studies, little nets where we just catch the little ones, count them, and then let them go. They're only going to spend about 2 to 3 weeks in Puget Sound, and they're heading out to the ocean as fast as they can. So if we want to talk about habitat, things like cutthroat and the coho are great because they have to literally spend an entire summer and an entire winter and find different places to go. So knowing exactly how many females, that's the driver, went up here, tells us how many come back out. And then you can look at for things called carrying capacity. At some point you can keep adding fish and you'll never get more fish back out because every available habitat is filled. For a chum, that could be the spawning area. There's no more places left to spawn. For the coho, the ones that have to spend an entire summer and winter, it's where can they survive in the winter and the summertime. Summer, it's called, they have to find cold water refugia. I've been on this lake on a boat. I assume we swim here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, way too hot for a fish. There's no way. They're not surviving here in the summertime. They got to go find upwelling areas called cold water refugia sites. That's going to be the limiting factor to their population. That's their carrying capacity.
And that's coho and chum?
No, not the chum. The chum's carrying capacity is based on the amount of spawning habitat. Because at some point, a female, there's no one left to spawn, so they're putting a red as their nest. They'll just put a red on top of a red. So you're digging up eggs to put more eggs. There's no way to do that. So it really takes it doesn't take a whole lot of female cohos to populate an entire system. Another one is high water refugia. Doesn't really apply to cranberry quite as much. You got to find places in the winter as a small juvenile fish to survive. If you've got giant floods going through, you're going to get washed out into Puget Sound. You're probably not going to make it. So you got to find different areas. Now, this lake probably is used by coho in the wintertime to survive because they can get out, it's nice and cool, and it doesn't have big flushing. And then in the spring, they can head out and then go. So one of the questions is, what do we see for populations? Huge crowd, better than I expected. Great. I've got 10 graphs of what we have for results. This trap was put in 1999. One of the reasons for that, as I said, the late 90s was this big general crash in coho. Chum seemed to be doing relatively well at the time. What we saw, and this graph is what you're going to see out here, is two different things. One, the bigger one is the chum, kind of expected. We always see more chum than coho. And then the smaller one is coho. The numbers for coho are probably average for a stream this size. Back in the early 2000s, 70, 80, 100 fish coming through within that. Again, it does not take a lot of females to populate an entire system like that. And the chum are thousands that you're going to see on this graph within this. So coho here and some of our other streams have had a little bit of a tough time lately, kind of going down even since I've been here. What's interesting about that is we talk about habitat effects. One of the places we don't see that is Goldsboro Creek, which goes down into Shelton. This is one in 2001, is a dam was removed that was owned by Simpson. It was basically a fish blocking dam. Goldsboro, as big as it is, was relatively minor salmon stream because it had this fish blocking dam basically in the city of Shelton itself. 2001, this thing was removed and this has taken off. What had been like 500-600 smolts baby coho going out is now, last year we had our highest one was 160 some thousand. That was more than the Nisqually River produced. So that's pretty powerful information because that's the exact same harvest, marine conditions, everything else that all these are going on, but yet Cranberry and Johns coho were still going down. So what that tells us is there's habitat effects going on here that we're not seeing in Goldsboro. You think Goldsboro, you probably think City of Shelton, like what's going on, but the reality is 98% of that is all up in forestry. It's all green diamond forestry up there. So one of the things we get back to is habitat effects. We're trying to figure out what's going on. There hasn't been huge changes within the Cranberry or Johns watersheds or some of the other ones that we look at. But what is the change? Now, you may have seen in the news in the last couple of years a lot of good research out of Washington State University about tire particulates and the effects on coho, especially. And it's pretty insane. They took stormwater straight from Seattle from their pipes, had these tanks, just dumped it into a thing with coho, and the juveniles within 2 minutes were swimming upside down versus that. And it turns out it's a very particular piece of chemical within tires within that. So has that changed within the last 5 years? I doubt it, but it's still stuff that we're looking at within these here. I think that's pretty much it. Kind of a quick background on the tribe, why I'm not a fan of dams, but I'm going to use them if I can. This is a huge benefit to us looking at the trap that's in here. Question?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for doing this, and I have never seen this group so quiet. But one of the big concerns, and one of the reasons that we wanted you to come down, is the trap. We get all kinds of complaints to the office, on Facebook, on Nextdoor. Oh my God, these poor fish, they've been in here for days. Nobody's done anything about it. They look like they're dying. What's happening here? I mean, this has been going on for 5 years that I've lived here.
Sure.
And so then I heard maybe yesterday or the day before that the trap gets emptied like twice a day. And so I'm just trying to get some, how does it work?
So there's called a fish ladder down here. So this is a dam. So just think, the stream's doing this. So if anybody's not seen it, you can really see it on the Deschutes. And if you guys have not been up there recently, they rebuilt the whole hatchery system on the Deschutes when the Chinook are coming back. What's really cool about that is the the Department of Fish and Wildlife put in a giant viewing window now. So if you ever been up to like Seattle and you go up to the locks, they have one of those
Right.
now at Tumwater.
Wow.
And it's the Chinooks. You can go up there when it's like 65 degrees and sunny and take your friends and stuff like that. But you can walk up the fish ladder, which is just a step system to go on. And you have one of these on here. Just ends in a giant cage. So yes, our goal is to have the technicians, the guys come out here, and girls, especially when the chum are running, and try to get it up to twice a day. No more than once every 2 days as it goes through. These are chum. You can go up to any of these streams, they'll pile into pools and sit there for days before they go on. They're looking a little rough because at the end of their life as they go through. So yes, we do try to get out here, and then stuff happens. Sometimes we might miss a day. Like I said, I don't think we've ever gone more than 2 days trying to get these fish out of here, but when the runs are big, they try to come out in the morning and the afternoon, count the fish, especially the chum, and get them out of there as fast as possible.
And they're not eating, are they?
They absolutely are not eating. So these fish, so we've got down here in South Sound, Chinook, not anywhere around here. Nisqually River has a natural run and hatchery, and the Deschutes has a hatchery run. We have coho, chum, and cutthroat, and apparently there used to be steelhead. I've heard there's one left somewhere. I haven't seen it. Those fish, the coho and the chum, will come back into Puget Sound about halfway down, stop eating. Within that, the females are preparing their eggs to be able to drop out. People still go out there and catch them. The chum, especially, the guys are at Kennedy Creek right now. There's all sorts of people out there. Chum, one of the reasons they're called dog salmon is their nickname. One, they got the big teeth, but they will, if you've been out there walking streams, they'll come after you. You know, they're not gonna hurt you, but they will nip at things. So they'll nip at hooks or something like that. The coho are sneakier. This is actually another good thing about cranberry I didn't touch on. The coho are really hard to find. Chum don't care. They'll go out in the middle and they'll do all this kind of stuff. Coho tend to love to go into the banks and hide and all this stuff. Cranberry is really ideal because we know how many fish went up here, but between here and the mouth, it's relatively open, and DFW and the tribe work together to do these spawning surveys where you walk and count the adults. This one I think is done by Department of Fish and Wildlife. They can count every single one, and it's really easy. But these coho are not eating when they're done. These fish will go up, they will spawn. The females will stay on the nest to protect them as long as possible and then die and they go through. Cutthroat are a little different. They're like, they're a trout. They can come up and they'll actually stop eating now too. They can spawn, then they can turn around and go back out into the ocean or out into Puget Sound. They can do up that to 3 times. They might come back within 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. They can do that 3 times. So they'll stop eating, they'll head up, they'll spawn. Female stay in the nest till she's done. Then she'll take off and go back out. They'll start eating again. Could spend 1 or 2 more years and then do it again within there. So we rarely see cutthroat this time of year in the trap. They're usually later. They're going to come through later in the winter to go through. So yes, no eating, no nothing.
And then I had one more question that I was watching at the base of Cranberry Creek, not base farther away, but right below the fish ladder. And it looked like some of them, and I'm not educated in fisheries, but do some of them spawn right there without going up the ladder? It looked like a few of them were spawning right there.
Yeah, so the question is, you're seeing spawning down there, and absolutely, cranberry down there, especially chum, there's spawning going on from here all the way through. If you're a fish, you want to spread it out. There's some fish that are going to want or have more energy, or less closer to death than the others that are going to keep pushing to go as far as possible within that. In general, the coho like to spawn higher than the chum within that, so what you're probably seeing is chum down there, and you'll see spawning. A female's coming up, she doesn't have enough energy, she'll spawn right when she comes out of the fresh water, hits the fresh water, and finds the first piece of gravel that she can spawn on, versus another one it's in really great shape. They'll just keep pushing on. That's good. That's what we want, is them to spread out. I could go on and on with stories and stuff like that, but one of the things we discovered down here is the timing of the rainstorms is a huge factor in how many coho we get. Because coho, I said, like to spawn really high up in the system. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's wetlands, there's beaver dams, there's lakes, there's all this. The more water you get, the easier it is for them to keep going. So we've shown if you get these big storms starting now, this is when we want them, versus later in the winter or really early in the fall, the coho get up higher, get up into better habitat and spread out, and we get a lot more fish within that. So yeah, they're spawning all the way through the whole system. Somebody back there?
Yeah, what's the process once they count or catch the fish here? Do they count and then put it back in the lake, or what's the process?
So the process, what do we do? The crew shows up, there's a trap here, and what do they do with the fish? So they'll count each of them and identify it as a male or a female and a coho or a chum. They'll look for marks, hatchery marks. So remember I said there's a little tiny fin on all the coho gets clipped out. They'll look for those, and then they'll have, it's called a wand. They look like little Thor's hammers now. They cost about $8,000. It's just a stupid magnetic detector is all it is, but it's proprietary. You can't do it. So this little tiny microscopic thing, you just go up there and it beeps because it's made of metal. So with those fish, they'll sacrifice those because they're hatchery fish anyways, and then we can take it back and find out. So I mentioned about the straying. We want less than 5%. We get about 0.3 to 0.5. Half of those are actually from Minter Creek Hatchery, consistently year to year. So that's up in Carr Inlet, way up there. The nearest, these are coho again, the nearest hatchery fish you would expect to find is the Squaxin Island net pens, which is just out here, but yet we find minter, or we'll find chambers, or we'll find a Puyallup fish every once in a while. So it gets a little interesting to see with the little straying going on. So the fish, then they're immediately thrown in and they go up and they can just do their own thing. Somebody?
What's the life cycle of a chum, coho, and cutthroat? I mean, what are we talking, years, a year? What is the average life cycle?
Yeah, so what it used to be versus what it is now. So what's the life cycle of these different fish that we're going out there? Any of them can live up to 3 to 6 years. It's pretty hard to get a 6-year-old anymore. So a 6-year-old means they would have to spend 2 to 3 years out in the deep ocean within that. So you'd have to survive 2 to 3 years of Alaskan fisheries going on there. If you swim down, you've got Russian fisheries, you got all this kind of stuff. They talk about the big fish back in the day, the 100-pounders and all those. Those were clearly mostly Chinook and probably 6-year-old fish. It's really hard to survive that long now. So what we have now is a fish comes in, let's say a chum. Chum comes in, eggs are laid, year 1. In the fall, they go out in the spring. They spend 2 years out in the ocean and then come back, and they're about 3 years old as a chum. The coho, as I explained, spend 1.5 years up in there here and then go out. So they're also coming back at about 3 years old. So when we talk about runs of the same fish, runs of chum or coho for all these, they're in 3s. And you can see that on that graph with the chum. The chum naturally do this anyways because there's odd year and even year chum. 1 year is way higher because the pinks are also even year, and there's the years that there's a lot of pinks, there's less chum because of the competition going out there. So we'll see these, the coho ideally all should be about the same, but you're gonna see these spikes in the chum with the 3-year classes. 1 year class being high, the next one low because they're competing with a bunch of pinks out in the ocean. The next year, no pinks, lots of chum. So about 3 years, occasionally we'll see 4, hard to see 5 and 6 anymore. Back there.
Can you speak to maintaining the riparian areas of lake chums?
Yeah, so I can speak to that, and with marine areas. So riparian zone, that's the area next to a water body and its importance. So a riparian zone can be grass or it can be a forest. riparian zones, forested, do a bunch of things. A lot of it has to do with water temperature within that. And it's not just giant trees going out blocking the sun. Trees act as a swamp cooler, an evaporative cooler. It's the exact same thing. Swamp coolers, they're not really popular up here. They actually work fairly well in the summer, but all it does is take water, runs it through the air, and it takes the heat out and adds a little bit of humidity. Well, guess what a tree does? So you can feel that walking into a riparian zone in a nice area, that coolness that goes in, that's not just the sun going on. Trees drop the temperature because they're taking water from the ground, they're running it through their leaf system going on, then they're pulling the heat out of what's going on right here. So two things going on. You block the amount of sun going on, and you actually cool up to 12 degrees the area around the stream. So that's not controversial on streams anymore. It was in the 70s and 80s. People were huge, there's no way, you know, you want us to plant next to it, this is our fields, or what, all this kind of stuff. But it's pretty accepted and it's pretty straightforward. And also all the runoff of water coming through, instead of running straight out into the stream, remember I was talking these chemicals from tires and stuff like that, that could all be picked up before it hits the stream by the riparian zone. All the duff, all the needles, leaves, the trees themselves blocking all that kind of stuff. So it applies also to the marine system as well as the lakes within that. Having riparian zones stops a lot of these chemicals and stuff going in there, provides food. A lot of the bugs that come in that these fish are going to eat, especially these coho and cutthroat that have to survive a whole summer and stuff like that, they're falling off these leaves and they're falling in from the trees and going in there. So riparian zones are really highly important. It's a very big deal for the tribe. Not outside of the agriculture community, which still fights it on fresh water. I don't think it's, you know, it's accepted. On the streams, we're hoping to get the acceptance on lakes and with the marine riparian too. So it's a process, it's an educational process. In the back.
So I live on Cranberry Creek, and the run started, about 3 weeks ago. Then we went out to Kennedy Creek last week, and it was like hardly anything coming up. Are the different creeks different times, or how's that work?
So the question was, are the different creeks different? You saw a good amount of fish up on Cranberry, but not on Kennedy. So this thing I passed out there, it sounds like I know what I'm talking about, right? We got all the signs down, we know what's happening. Fish never do what you want them to do or what you think they should do. I mentioned that coho were having a bit of a rough time, except for Goldsboro, we're not sure why. The last 5 years for Puget Sound has been really tough on chum, and nobody knows why. No change in fishing, nothing else, no change in the amount of pinks. The Chinook and coho are doing about the same, but also the chum returns are not doing as well. Except for a couple places. If that map I handed out, look at the last couple of years on Cranberry Creek, the amount of chum are going way up. Well, Kennedy Creek, because it's an educational creek, this whole area is probably studied more than any other, their chums are going down. Why Kennedy Creek, which is like right next door, under the same harvest and all that, and what's going on with Cranberry that's going up? Nobody knows. So absolutely, each individual system behaves differently, and it's hard for me to wrap my head around that deer's right there. The mouths are two together, but they could act independently of each other. And there's, was there one big set of a Russian trawler that caught a whole bunch of chum? Who knows? I don't know, and it's hard to tell, but we see that every single year. There's a difference between one stream and another, and right now, Cranberry is doing really well for chum, and no explanation why.
Is Cranberry then protected by the tribe and all down to Oakland Bay and all the way up to Cranberry Lake? Is it protected?
So the question is it protected by the tribe?
Well, and
absolutely not, and
okay.
not protected at all, except
Not
for
private.
the mouth is has a conservation with Capital Land Trust. That's called the Twin Rivers because of deer and Cranberry Creeks. And then the rest of it, there's a decent amount of forestry with green, diamond, and maybe others up there. That is, in my mind, protected because I think there's pretty successful forest practices rules. This isn't the 70s and 60s. They do a lot better job on maintaining riparian zones. In most cases, I'd say at 300 feet's the minimum, but the science through the forest practices shows 150 feet minimum riparian. I think that's worked, and my example is the places where we have forestry and not people is the only places we still have fish. Where we don't have forestry, we don't really have fish a lot anymore. Where a place that's almost all forestry, Goldsboro, is doing great as far as things go. So no, there's no extra protection. The tribe has no real extra say as far as protection. We weigh in just like anybody else. I can throw a lot more science than maybe you guys can, maybe some of you guys can, but if you see things going on for development or things like that, so no, there is no extra protection at Cranberry versus anything else.
So Cranberry is up in its population of chum, but
We
it's
don't know
not
why.
any more protected.
Right, no idea why.
Follow up to her question, can the fish make it into Cranberry Lake, or is there a barrier? Meaning Cranberry Creek isn't that long. Can they make it into Cranberry Lake?
Up on the top end?
Yeah.
Yeah, as far as I know, that's a good question. I'd have to go back. I don't remember. It's been a long time. Yes, they have been seen up there. Whether they go past that, I don't know. Yes.
There was a culvert replaced over here about 20 years ago. And just being here, it seemed like the population of fish coming up the ladder really increased after that. But by your map, it shows even before in the 90s, it still had a pretty good chum run.
Yeah.
Have they looked at the other culverts that might be needing replaced?
Yeah, so the question's culverts. That's a huge one. I go back to the dam removal on Goldsboro Creek. That's a blockage. A culvert's a blockage. The tribes sued the state of Washington over the culvert case that you heard. To me, that was a ridiculous one, is that the Department of Transportation hired Department of Fish and Wildlife to look at all the culverts. And they came back and there's all these blocked culverts. 100% illegal. It's been illegal since the 1910s to put in a fish blocking culvert. But the state did it anyways.
Wow.
They put those things in there. DOT's response was, okay, as these culverts fail, we'll replace them. So the tribes had this report saying you have all these fish blocking culverts, and here's the thousands of miles of habitat it would open, and you're not going to replace them until they fall apart anyways. That was an easy slam dunk case. But it's also instantaneous fish response. Again, the dam was removed. Within 2 years, we saw huge rebounds in there. That culvert that was replaced up here was a partial blockage, so some fish could still get through, and a lot of the chum still spawned down in this area anyways. A partial blockage, I think it was like, I don't forget it, they do them by thirds. It was 33%, 66%, or 100%, and I forget which one it was. But it definitely blocks fish going through. Immediate response, you pull that out the very next day, you get fish going out of there. One of our success stories up in Goldsboro is we worked with Simpson Railroad, and most people don't know this, but railroads are exempt from anything to do with fish passage. They don't have to do anything. Simpson worked with us on 2 tributaries in Goldsboro that had been blocked for over 110 years. And we replaced those culverts, and the very next year, there's fish up there spawning, and we could see an immediate response to the amount of juveniles going in there. So that's a huge deal. So Department of Fish and Wildlife, working with partners like South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group, are going out there and inventorying every single public culvert that they can find. The South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group is working with private culvert owners in there. And there's a huge push right now to get as many culverts open as possible. So yeah, that completely had an effect on the amount of fish. Now it gets really complicated because how many more chum were there versus in there? You want to do one little tiny project, but you got to look at globally, were chum back up anyways, and you still got more, or did you have an effect or not? it's easy on a culvert. We do projects like putting wood back in the streams. Another one that's not really known until the 1980s, it was required, they were pulling wood out of the streams. My very first project for the Squaxin Island tribe as I got here was on Skookum Creek. That's the one that goes where the casino is, where
Yeah.
the main part of the reservation. And we were putting a bunch of wood in the stream. My boss, who had been there for like 40 years, looked at it. He's like, huh. He's like, my first job working for Fish and Wildlife is I literally pulled the wood out of that section of stream because Fish and Wildlife required it with timber cuts. Now, what they were living off on back in the day is all this has been clear cut. And a lot of them, they would dump the wood in the streams, build splash dams. They would build a temporary dam, make a lake, put all the wood in it, blow the dam up, and then the wood would rush out in the Puget Sound. So there was a bunch of wood left over. So there was probably a good idea to remove some of that, but that just turned into institutional, remove all wood, get it out of there. So I literally put wood in there, and my boss was like, so the ologists told us 40 years ago wood was bad, and now the ologists are telling me that wood is good and we got to put it back in. To do a project like that and find the effect of what it did for fish is really hard. Culverts are like the slam dunk as far as you get immediate response and you see an uptick in the population. Yes?
Now, salmon, they don't spawn in the lakes, right?
Correct.
Usually it's because there's not rocky bottom.
Right.
Stuff like that. So, when they get up into Cranberry Lake, do they go to streams out, the incoming streams?
Yes. Yep.
Do we know that they're up there?
Yeah, they asked before whether they got past Cranberry or into Cranberry. Yeah, so we do spotting surveys up in there and they'll go look. There's way less up there, but yeah, we do. And we also do, one of the more fun things I do is we do juvenile surveys in the summertime. So that's putting on snorkels and dry suits and snorkel and go count fish in there. Back in the day, you used to do electrofishing. You would just use an electric thing and temporarily knock them out. But now we just do it by snorkels and do counting. So we know that juveniles definitely use it up there in those areas.
So then a lot of fish do spawn between this upper part of Cranberry
Oh yeah, the
Creek
whole
and
system's important. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Couldn't we make a more friendly trap that automatically counts them, allows them to keep running on a regular basis?
So the question is whether we could do an automatic counter and have it do it in there. And yes, the technology is just getting there at this point. They've had it for a while where they've done it with videos. So everything comes down to a tube and you have a camera running. And then somebody goes back later and sits at a computer and looks at each one going through to do that. Very labor intensive, very expensive. Computing's got to the point now where they've tested out quite a few up in the Seattle area in the locks of having, it's a sonar type system, and then a computer algorithm goes through and it'll tell you what fish it is and whether it has the adipose, and it can still have an automatic gate. It can still scan for the chip, and if it's a hatchery fish, it gets shunted this way into a thing and the other ones keep going. Very expensive, still relatively new. I mentioned there was 3 traps down here in South Sound. I think a 4th one is about to go in on the Nisqually. They have a dam up by Yelm somewhere, and they're looking really hard at doing that. And so, yeah, that's the future, clearly. Yes?
What's the one on in Delta?
Yeah, the Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group does that one.
Just ask about Hood Canal. Yeah, I don't, the Skookum mission, I don't do anything there.
I volunteer at that trail.
So how long does this go on?
Where they can keep trapped. I mean, is there a point where they take it out, just let everything else go by?
Yeah, so the question is, how long do we keep this trap in here? So this fish ladder's open all the time.
Right.
So any fish could do what? We put the trap in, it went in last Tuesday, and we'll take it out soon as we're really focusing on coho. So the chum will be coming in after those. So once the coho really die down, so probably another 3-4 weeks is my guess. And then it just goes back to its open, and then anybody can do whatever they want. That's when cutthroat will come through. We're not trying to get in their way or stop at nose and things like that.
Well, there's probably at least 1,000 fish that made it here before you put it in the.
Yeah, We were late this year. It was we're having COVID
Yeah.
problems and stuff like that.
Dean stood up there and counted them
But
all.
those would have been, we assume, a lot of those were the early chum,
Yeah.
called summer chum. That's another, again, I could go on and on, man. I'm going to bore you guys. So summer chum, you hear about them in Hood Canal a lot. You guys live here, you probably hear about summer chum. But if you talk to anybody in Washington, they talk about summer chum. They talk about them in Hood Canal because they're ESA, Endangered Species Act listed. So they were so endangered, the summer chum in Hood Canal, that they were put on special protection in there. And then that gets the federal government involved and all sorts of stuff. The populations, there's also summer chum down here in South Sound. What the people in Hood Canal forget is on any given year, 50 to 60% of all the summer chum produced in the state of Washington are from these streams, Johns, Cranberry, Deer. So what's interesting is you look where these streams go is they all were at one time connected to Hood Canal back in the glacier days. You've ever seen LiDAR? That's where they can use these.
Yeah.
Yeah, people, rough idea, but you get an idea of what the whole ground looks like minus any vegetation. You look at these LiDAR maps, there's clearly a river system running from here to Hood Canal. And Johns Creek, Bayshore, is the mouth of an old giant river system. It's clearly a delta from a river. So the streams that connect it back and forth are where we see these summer chum in here. And so ours are doing relatively well, as we like to show, because of our management techniques or luck, I don't know. Whatever, where Hood Canal has spent a lot of money, but they're actually going to be one of the few success stories to get an endangered species off the endangered species list, kind of like we did with bald eagles nationwide, but that's one of the few success stories where they've actually got that population back up. Yeah.
We've been seeing groups of 9 or 10 go by. Is that because they tend to gather, or is it because they're being released out of the trap as groups?
So you're saying you see groups, and why? Out in Puget Sound, they're schooled. They're not coming by an individual. Out in the ocean, they're in big schools. That's why a giant trawler is dangerous, because they can find a giant school of fish, put a big net around it, and get the whole thing. So they tend to like to stay together within that. I'm sure it's some sort of protection type. It definitely is out in the deep ocean. You got, a tuna or something coming after you. The more you school, the better you is. And it's probably the same thing up here. I don't know how it helps against a bear or a raccoon, but they definitely school together. Yeah.
What would you say the ultimate goal of all this work is? Is it to increase the population, or make it more resilient, or to just understand it better, or?
So the question, what's the ultimate goal of this? What do we want to do? I was hired to the tribe. It was refreshing. They're like, just do science. Don't worry about any of the other stuff, just do science. And I'm like, okay, what's the goal? What do you guys want? And we would like to see healthy populations of salmon at harvestable levels to support our tribal people. So the goal is to increase the populations to what we can. We're never going to get back to pre-white people showing up and putting all this infrastructure in here. But what can we do to get back up to the highest levels possible in there? And it's a hard question to figure out in there. There's some systems, Goldsboro, where I've got the last couple projects in my mind and we're done. And then it's just walk away and let the forest, where the riparian go. There's other ones that in here it's going to be harder. Then we're going to have to figure out what we ultimately want to do. But no, I do not want some sort of open-ended, it's going to go on forever. The studying will, absolutely. We're going to have to do that. About as far as restoration or conservation, at some point we're going to have an endpoint of like, okay, we did everything we can do. This is what the population is.
And how far off is it from those days to now?
Depends. In a system like Goldsboro, and we're using models to do a lot of this stuff. You hear a lot of every model's wrong, but some of them are better than others. The ones on Goldsboro are showing that we're almost there. In there. Other ones like this, I can't remember. We've done a model on this, and we're maybe half of what it had been back in the day. We're never going to get back to the full amount, and I don't know what the new amount is going to be. But I'd say in most of, well, some of them are gone. A lot of them in the big cities like Olympia and stuff like that, they're gone. There's a little remnant, a couple
Tom,
fish show up.
take this one.
You're never getting back on those. It's these where we still have some sort of semblance of natural habitat somewhere. What we can get to. So I would half, 50, 60%. The question is, do we post them? And no, we haven't been. This is the first time I think that it came out and handed out. And you know, so you had a great idea. It's like, you know, people are interested. Is there something we could do? And I could get with the committee and whether we want to do it on a website or do some sort of a, Sue's mentioned maybe do an information sign or something like that. Yeah, something we could do.
Well, we're sure you must be freezing at this point, like I am.
I'm in the sun.
Yeah, we could have did this yesterday.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there a place we can look to see when you're first starting to let them go through each season?
You mean see the adult fish?
Yeah, there must come a time when you start monitoring these fish and keeping them and counting them. When that starts, is that posted anywhere?
So you're trying to understand, you want to go see where the adult fish.
I want to know when the run starts here and going through the lake.
Oh, well, as someone said, we put the trap in Tuesday, but there was probably already 1,000 chum that already went through. So I don't know. We're trying to catch just the coho without too impacting them. So I would say the coho starting last Tuesday when the trap goes in until we go it out. I don't know after that.
Yeah, so
when it stops.
my question really is, if you're putting the trap in on a Tuesday,
Sure.
is there any way that could be posted in our community on the website so those of us that are...
Oh, I gotcha. Yeah, I put that on the committee. We have to ask permission, right? Don't we talk to you guys before we come in?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Oh, we don't ask permission. We just do it.
It's ongoing.
It's an ongoing. Okay. Yeah, no, we can do that.
Is there any programs developed that we, as members of Lake Limerick, that would be helping the coal come through?
To help them go through?
Help them regenerate.
Not, well, I don't know. I don't know if Lake
Leslie?
Limerick committees have something. I assume you have a riparian committee, something? Don't you guys talk about lawn use?
Yeah, we have a lake dam committee that looks at lawns and, you know, close to the lake, how many feet you can have a lawn by the lake and all that stuff.
Well, that's huge. And so there is a committee that talks about that. And this is something I don't get involved in, is you got to deal with nutrients in your lake.
Yeah, we do.
That has a huge impact on the health of the lake and the fish anyways. We don't really get into that, but that's a big deal. This gets back into riparian zones. You know, I'm not going to push that too far, but mostly on marine I've had to deal with this. People want their green lawn down to the Puget Sound. And we've actually hired an artist to go through. You could actually frame your view. Think of like classic Japanese stuff where, you know, you stand somewhere, it looks like a picture. You could do that on your shorelines, and we've shown people do that. You cut a certain tree out or cut certain branches and have this, what I think is a better view, a beautiful view. Still have some sort of riparian to go through, but no, there's that. There's the South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group, does a lot of educational work and restoration work, a lot of riparian planting and stuff like that. They would be a great benefit to come down here and start talking about people who want to do voluntary restoration on their pieces of property or do plantings or what could I do and still have a view and still help out. They're great for that kind of stuff.
So in other words, Jack should start going to the Lake Dam Committee again.
Well, I think he started the new riparian committee and Jack's the chair and I support that.
So it's,
Cool, great questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks for the invite.